Good afternoon and welcome to this Chemistry World webinar. I'm Ben Valsler, Chemistry World's digital editor. Thank you for joining us today. Now, I'm going to get to the content of today's webinar in just a minute, but first I'd like to introduce the software that we're using and how you can use it to make the most of the next hour. We're using GoToWebinar. It may be familiar to some of you by now. A couple of things that are useful for you, especially if you're on a slow connection. We'll be using webcams throughout, but if you're on a slow connection, you can turn them off. So just above my head, there will be a button where you can choose, I think by default it says view everyone. You can choose to hide webcams, and that way you still see everything we share on screen, you hear everything we say, but you don't waste your bandwidth on webcams. So that's a good way to make sure that you make the most of it. But really the key thing about any webinar platform is its ability to allow you to interact with our speakers today. And the best way for you to do that is to ask any questions that you have at any point throughout the webinar. There should be at the bottom of the GoToWebinar panel a little box where you can send a question to the panelists. So get any question you have in at any point throughout the webinar itself. We'll have a Q&A session after the presentation. We're also going to run a few polls today, which really help us to get to know who you are as an audience, helps us to shape this webinar, helps me to choose which questions to ask, but also helps us to shape future webinars as we make sure that we get the right content for you, our audience. So do please engage with those polls, ask any questions you have at any point throughout the webinar, and we will make this a nice interactive event and not just sitting back and watching a presentation. Now, speaking of watching presentations, if you miss any part of today, or if you have to leave early, or if there are connection issues or anything like that, don't worry, because we will send you a link to a recorded version of this webinar. Now, we don't share slides from our webinars for a couple of reasons. Partly, events like today's, it's not all slides. There's also some software demos. You will see live software demonstration as part of the presentation. But also we think that what's important is not just the slides on their own, but the context of what's being said and the software demo and the Q&A that comes with it. So rather than sending out slides, we'll send you a link to the recorded version of the entire thing, and then you'll be able to watch that at leisure. And for those of you who have joined us live today, you will also get a certificate in your inbox. That'll be in the same email that has a link to the recording. That will be with you in a couple of days' time. So keep an eye out for that. That's just our way of saying thank you. Now, today we're looking at how to find robust operating points using JMP's simulation experiment tool. We're going to learn how simulations can be used to minimize defect rate and improve crucial targets. When you're in the early stages of developing a new process, you're often driven by things like performance and yield, and that can mean that other important factors such as scalability, robustness, validity actually get assessed quite late on in the life cycle. And at that point, adaptations and changes can prove quite costly. So JMP, who I'm sure you will have heard of before, they're our partners for this webinar, and we've been working with them for the last few years to bring you excellent, relevant content to people working in the chemical sciences. They've developed something called this JMP's simulation experiment tool, and that's capable of running over 100 simulated experiments in a matter of seconds, which allows scientists to calculate overall defect rates and visualize factors using a 3D space filling design. So it's really easy to see what's going on. So if you have simulation experiment and a valid design of experiments model, you can characterize any operating point within your range. You can quantify it in terms of defect rate and standard deviation of the output variation, which allows you to have a look at several targets simultaneously, and you can identify all of those factors that you will need to know. Now, that is the tool that JMP have produced, but the best way for you to understand how that can be worked is to have a look at a real case study. And so today we'll be joined by Baril from Lonza. She has used the JMP simulation tool with a focus on the biopharmaceutical industry, and we'll show you how that's worked for her. We also have, as you can see on screen, Emmanuel Romeu, who is going to join us to help answer some of your questions in the background. He may or may not show up in the Q&A bit at the end, depends how much time we have, but he is here, so if you have JMP specific questions, get them into that question box and he will happily be able to answer them for you. So thank you to Emmanuel for joining us. Before I tell you a bit more about Claire and her work, I'd like to get to know a bit more about you. So we're going to run the very first poll straight away, and then we will come back and tell you more about Claire, and then I'll hand you over. So what are the two most important things that you would like to know at the end of this presentation? Are you looking to find out the benefits of using the simulation experiments tool? Are you interested in the theory behind it? Do you want to know how to use it in JMP if you're already a JMP user, for example, or do you want to look at the challenges when applying this tool? Now, please do vote in this poll. It really helps us to understand who you are and what is the best way to get the most out of this. Now, I'm just going to give you a little chance to vote, and while I do, a little reminder for those of you who've just arrived, ask questions at any point. We really are really keen to hear from you and hear your questions. That you will get a link to the recording, and you'll get a certificate for those of you who showed up live. If you are watching the recording and think, oh, well, I wish I could have got a certificate, have a look at chemistryworld.com/webinars. We do run roughly one a month with JMP. So if this is a subject area that you're interested in, have a look at that page. You'll see the upcoming events we've got with JMP. Join us live. That means you can ask your questions. It means you get that certificate. You get the full value of a webinar experience. Watching the recording is great and a really useful way to learn, but if you really want to ask questions, then you have to join us live. I think most of you have voted now. Let's close this down and have a look. Let's see what things people wanted to get out of it, so you can see how you compare to the rest of the audience. So most people want to know what the benefits are and then how to actually use it. But half of you are interested in the theory behind it as well. And slightly fewer of you are interested in the challenges, which is good because it sounds like you're all keen, ready and raring to get going. So let me introduce our main speaker for today, Claire Baril. She's a development scientist at Lonza AG in Visp in Switzerland. She's responsible for the development of microbial fermentation processes in lab scale. She has an MSc in chemical engineering and biotechnology, which she got back in 2017. She uses JMP in particular to set up and analyze the design of experiments approaches. So Claire, thank you very much for joining you. We're going to hand over to you now. I know we've got a presentation to come and a live demonstration of JMP. The audience out there, please keep your questions coming in throughout the presentation. Claire will be more than happy to answer them when we get to the end. So we should just hand over to Claire, so we'll see your screen shortly. There we go. Claire, we can definitely see you. Could you say hello so we can check we can hear you?
Hello.
We can definitely hear you as well. Claire, thank you so much for joining us. As you've just seen, people are really keen to know the benefits, to know a bit of the theory, to know how to do this. So you are very much set up with a very keen audience, and I look forward to seeing your presentation. So thank you for joining us, and I'll speak to you again in a few minutes for the next poll.
Thank you very much, Ben, for the introduction and for giving me the opportunity to present my work here today. And hello, everyone. I'm going to open up the presentation. So I've split this session in two. First, I'll give a presentation to introduce what was the goal of the project, what was my motivation for using the simulation experiment, give you an idea of what the general approach was, and show you some of the end results I obtained. And once that's finished, then I'll show you in JMP how I did it. So it's going to be a live demo. Right, so just opening here the presentation. So I think Ben nicely introduced the topic, so I can jump right into the topic. So my project was running during early phase process development. So this is a stage in industrial biopharmaceutical biotech where the process is not yet fixed and parameters can still be changed and optimized. And the goal of the project was to find an operating point which on the one hand met targets with respect to process performance and quality attributes, and on the other hand that was robust. And so to meet these two goals, I searched for which tools I could use. And for the first goal, it was clear that I needed to build a DOE, and in JMP use the DOE platform with then the analyze fit by model, allowing me to build the model, and then using the prediction profiler to be able to analyze it and draw conclusions. For the second goal, I wasn't sure. This was something completely new for me. So I asked the question in the JMP community, and what was advised I should test was the simulation experiment tool. And so this can be found in the prediction profiler in JMP. There's a tab simulator, and in the simulator you find then the simulation experiment. And then what I needed was to be able to generate a model based on my simulated data, and for this the Gaussian process was recommended. Before I get too much into the detail, it was important to define, first of all, how I was going to define robustness and how I was to quantify it. And in JMP, you can quantify it as two things. First of all, as the defect rate, and second of all, as the standard deviation of the output variation. So let me explain how this works. So let's imagine you're operating at a given operating point. And let's say that you run at this point 100 times. And what you observe is that in your response, so for example, the product concentration, you get a distribution of the product concentration. And why is that? Well, it's because during each run, there's potential variation in the factors. So if we take, for example, the pH, there's a pH probe, and this pH probe might have an accuracy of plus minus 0.3 in the reactor. And so you might be running at 7.3, or you might be running at 6.7 if the set point is 7.0, but you don't know that. So this input variation creates then output variation, which you can define it as defect rate. So when the entire distribution is within the specs, then you can say that you have a defect rate of 0%. And you can also see it in terms of how wide this distribution is. So if you have lots of variation, then your standard deviation will be big. And this is an indication that your point is not so robust. So that's how it was defined. And now moving on to why the simulation experiment tool was extremely helpful in answering my goals. So the first motivation to use it is that it's a simulation tool. So it's extremely fast, and you can get in a really short time a very good idea over your entire design space. Where is the product concentration high, or where do I have robust operating points? The second motivation is that this tool allows you to find the best compromise when you have several targets to fulfill. So if I take the example in my project, I had the first target, which was to maximize the final product concentration. And the second target was to find a robust operating point. And here I've plotted the pH against the temperature, and one sees that the highest final product concentration is located here. And for my second target, I want the smallest standard deviation, and it's the best point would then be here. And what the tool will do is actually then find the best compromise and land somewhere here in between. Okay, And so if we take a step back and not look at only how it's from a technical point of view interesting, but also what are the benefits in general of doing this in early phase stage process development, I would say there are three key benefits. The first one is mitigating risk for your process. In that, I mean that it's allowing you to identify early on in the process development what is having a high influence on your process and allowing you to make changes while it's still possible. The second benefit is that it reduces process sensitivity. What I mean here is that using this tool, you are able to maybe switch onto operating at a more stable operating point, which means that ultimately the chance of getting batch-to-batch variability or the risk of deviations would be reduced. And the third benefit I saw was that to optimize the process, it's the fastest way to get there because it's a simulation and it goes much quicker than trying to find it manually, going left and right and seeing what's the impact then on the product concentration. So those were the main benefits. And then I'd like to shortly present what was the general approach to getting there. So the work was split into two milestones. The first milestone was to obtain a validated DOE model. And so this work was presented in the Discovery Summit 2 years ago. If you want more information on that, there's the URL that was in the holding slide. And then the second milestone was to find the optimal operating point based on this model. And there were 3 steps. So first, I had to define what were the exact objectives with subject matter experts. So people that are experts in the process, who know the process very well, they're going to say what they need. And then my task was then to correctly translate what were the objectives into JMP. And then the second task was to set up then the experiment and to run it in JMP. And the third step was to then evaluate all the different operating points that came out of the analysis and ultimately then select which one was most suited. So this slide summarizes how I did found these robust operating points in JMP. So the first step was to set up the experiment, then to run the simulation experiment, and then this experiment generated 128 points randomly distributed in the design space. And based on these points, a model was created using the Gaussian process. And then as the fourth step, it was to maximize the desirability. So to say what were my targets and what I want to optimize. So I had a model for the product concentration, the defect rate, and the standard deviation. And here in this step, you define what you want to minimize, what you want to maximize, and which of the three is more important. And then step number 5. So after step number 4, you get a setting, and then you want to take a look at how it's going to look like in the DOE model that you have, if it's actually possible to operate at this point. So you're going to link the prediction profiler of the Gaussian process to the prediction profiler of the DOE model. And then steps 6 and 7 are steps to document the work, to document then each time that you find a setting, to save it, so that in the end you can compare it with the other settings. Okay. And here are the final settings that I found. So here each row is one setting, starting from the center point conditions, where all the 4 factors were set at 0, and then initial settings were the settings I had before performing any optimization. I had then the settings where I had only optimized and maximized the product concentration. Then a setting where I had minimized then the standard deviation, so to get the most robust point. And then finally, for example, 7 is the compromise between maximizing titer and minimizing the standard deviation. And at the end, I was able to answer 3 questions. So first question was, determine how robust a current operating point is. So to answer this question, you have then the column standard deviation, and you take a look at how wide is the distribution. So in the center point, it's the standard deviation of the output distribution is higher than for other settings. When we maximize the titer, the standard deviation was high, meaning that the point was not so robust compared to the most robust operating point, which was here setting 5 with the lowest standard deviation. The second question was find the most stable operating point. So that was again setting number 5. And then question number 3, find the best possible operating point based on multiple targets. That was for me setting 7. So the product concentration was at 80%. It was high, but we could reduce then the standard deviation to a minimum. So with that, I'm finished with the first part, and we can go on to the second poll.
Well, thank you very much. Still lots to come as well, but we're going to just find out a little bit more about you as an audience. Let's get that second poll up as soon as it will allow. So are you using simulation experiment at the moment to find robust settings for your operation? This really helps us to know how much of our audience are already familiar with some of the principles involved, and it also gives us an idea of really quite how much detail we can go into, because if you're all very familiar, then we know that that we can gloss over some of the basics and really highlight some of the exciting aspects of it. We in the meantime can just remind you to keep your questions coming in. So looking at the questions list at the moment, we've got a handful in, but we will have time for a few more at the end. So if you have any questions at any point throughout the presentation, please put them in, and we can should be able to find some time at the end of the presentation to ask as many as possible. So anything that occurs to you at any point throughout the presentation, don't wait until the end, just get your question in now. Okay, I think that's probably enough time for this poll. Let's close it down and let's see how we break down. So share those results. So 25% of our audience today are already using simulation experiment, but 75% aren't. Now, obviously, that could be because this is the first they've heard of it, or it could be because they've made a practical decision not to. Is that sort of roughly what you expected to see, Claire? I mean, you said that you had to ask the JMP community before you knew that this was the right approach. So does it surprise you that 3/4 of our audience are not using this at the moment?
So it's the simulation experiment tool is within the prediction profiler, so it might not be the easiest to find, and maybe just not everyone has thought of this option, and it might not also be applicable to, because this is a really specific case to optimize optimize operating points.
I guess this does demonstrate that one of the benefits of the fact that JMP has a very active user community online is that if you're not quite certain what the best way to approach something is, you can go and ask people, you can read about other people's experience in case studies, and clearly in your case, it was the right thing to do. People pointed you in the right direction and you got the results that you needed.
Yeah.
So that's another benefit to using JMP, is that fantastic JMP user community online. Okay, so let's hand control back to you to carry on with the rest of your presentation. Still another poll to come a little bit later on before we then go to some Q&A. So do keep your questions coming in, and we look forward to seeing the rest of Claire's presentation. Take it away, Claire.
Thank you. Okay, so this is the demo part in JMP. Hopefully anything that wasn't really clear now becomes easier to understand. And so I'm going to guide you through the 7 steps briefly here today. The 7 steps I did in JMP to find the robust operating points. And to start with, you can see here the data set. So we have the 4 settings, the 4 factors: the feed rate, the complex compounds, the temperature, and the pH. And the response that I had was the final product concentration. And based on this table, then I built a DOE model, which was the result of milestone 1. And this table summarizes the main effects which are included in the models. So in first positions, we have some main effects, pH and the temperature. And then there were some interaction effects, and you see no quadratic effects. And yes, so if I make just this a bit bigger, here you see the settings that were obtained when maximizing the product concentration only. Just going to get here. And so you see that in 3 out of the 4 settings, we're on the slope is quite steep, so it gives the highest product concentration, but it may not be the most robust operating point. And so, yeah, this was milestone 2, figuring out where did we have some robust operating points which might be more suited to operate at. And for this, the first step was to then set up the to set up the experiment and to enter the input variation. And so here to win time, I've entered this already. So again, the input variation is the extent and shape of the variability in process inputs. So when the inputs, so the settings of the factors, the settings of the factors are set, there could be a potential deviation from this set point. And this is what had to be defined here. So in my case, I chose a uniform distribution, meaning that the probability was equally distributed within the range. And this is a sort of worst case approach. And it could also have been a normal distribution or a normal truncated. It really depends on your case. For example, if I had had historical data on how when operators are weighing the complex compounds, if they're weighing exactly always at the set point, or if they're there's a plus minus amount that they're always weighing more or a bit less, then I could see this and adapt my distribution and then the input variation. So this takes a bit of time to define. Once this is defined, then you can move on to here entering the specification limits. So these specification limits are needed to calculate your defect rate. So as I had explained, the defect rate is telling you how much of the output distribution is within the specs. And so you have to define here specifications. And in my case, I said that I accepted a final product concentration of 80% or above. And then, so once this has been set up, we can move on to step 2, which is running the simulation experiment. And this is done here. And it will ask you 2 questions. How many experimental runs would you like? By default, it's going to do 128. And then the second question is, what portion of the factor space do you want to explore? Do you want to simulate on? And a recommended value is to take the entire space, so to define 1. And later on, if you need to fine tune and get see more precisely what's going on in one specific area of your design space, then you can reduce it. But for the first simulation, a recommended value is 1. Right, okay. And then you click OK, and then a simulation table with all the results appears. Just reducing to the important columns. So here you have 128 rows corresponding to the 128 points generated by the simulation. And for each point, you have the resulting factor settings. And then there are these 3 columns. So the final product concentration mean, what is that? So that's basically for, let's take point number 1. it took this this point, and on this point it simulated 5,000 runs, written over here 5,000, and on these, based on these 5,000 runs, since there's input variation, then there's going to be an output distribution, and the mean of this distribution for the first point was 44, and you see here the standard deviation then is given in this column, and then the defect rate, so how much of the distribution is within the specs, is given here. So here 100% are outside the specs. Okay, and so now moving on, based on these 128 points, we want to build a model for these 3 responses. And by default, you see here Gaussian process, and this will generate a model for the defect rate. And in my particular case, I was also interested in having a model for the mean and the standard deviation. So I went over here into specialized modeling Gaussian process, and then I put the 4 factors here as X, and then the 3 responses I was interested here as the Y. And then I pressed OK, and it takes now a few seconds to generate the models. Okay. Just gonna close these. Let's see. Yeah, it's still in progress. Okay, so while that's loading, how am I on time? 37. Yeah. Should appear soon.
Well, while that is processing, Claire, this seems like an opportune time to say you're running JMP. For the people who are not currently running JMP in the audience, do you have any special technology to run this, or will this run on a normal laptop, desktop PC?
Yes, it will run on a normal desktop PC.
Right. So sometimes we do have to wait for things to chug through, but that's not because these requests are being sent off to a supercomputer in San Francisco or anything like that. It's just running on standard technology that everybody should be able to have access to. Great. Has that all come through now?
Yes.
Looks like your models are there. Okay. Well, I thought that was a good opportunity just to talk about some tech. I'll leave you to it.
Thanks. So this is the prediction profiler showing then the relationship between the factor settings and the 3 responses that I wanted to analyze. And this is then here, step number 3. We've run the Gaussian process and we've obtained the prediction profiler. And now we move on to maximizing the desirability. So in JMP, you have very important tool, which is the desirability functions. And what are these? So these are basically defining. It gives you the chance to define how you want to optimize certain responses. If you want to maximize them, as it's shown here, or then minimize your responses or then not take them into consideration. So let's say I want to find the most robust operating point. I want to ignore these two responses and only focus on minimizing this one. So I go here to set desirabilities. And then, so for final product concentration, I don't want any targets. Oh, don't want any target for the mean. And here for the standard deviation, I want to minimize. And this is what you see here. Now it's adapted then the desirability functions, and then I can go here and then simply maximize the desirability. And it finds you the point where this response is the lowest. And this will correspond then to this point in the design space. So this is step number 4. And then step number 5 is then linking your profilers. So going back then to the initial model. Also, I've closed it. I'm just going to open it really quickly. DOE model here. And make it a bit bigger. So when I link the profilers like this, go to factor settings and just have to do this one more time. Okay. So I don't know why it's not working, but oh, maybe because I think I need to re-hit maximize the desirability. Okay, there we go. So these were the settings I found, and then they're brought over to the DOE model that I had in the beginning. And here you see it's the slope is much flatter. So we're at a more robust point. So yeah, this is what I wanted to show you today. Would then just go back to the presentation and finish off. So thank you very much for your attention. I also want to take the opportunity to say thanks to everyone who helped me on the way. So Martin Demel and Emmanuel Romeu here today from JMP, and from Lonza sites, Sven Steinbuch. And here, in case you want to know more about the simulation experiment, there are 3 great tutorials in JMP that you can view online. Yeah, so with that, I'm finished with the presentation, and I hand it over then to Ben for the 3rd poll.
Thank you very much, Claire. Just so you know, in case you hadn't spotted it in GoToWebinar, the chat box allows us to send you messages as well. So we've just sent links to those the workshops that Claire just mentioned. It's a lot easier for you to click through those or copy and paste them to have a look later than it would have been to try and copy them down. So have a look in the chat there. Before we go to Q&A, we do have that 3rd poll. We're just interested to know a little bit more about you. Let's get that up on screen now. Do you see a possible application in your field of expertise for the JMP simulation experiment tool? So it's simple yes or no. You can pick one or the other. And then we will crack into your questions. So do please keep the questions coming in, even though we only have probably 12 minutes left to actually ask some questions. Keep them coming in and we'll see if we can get through as many as possible. We'll give people plenty of chance to make sure as many people as possible can vote, and then we will close that down. So a final reminder, if you missed the beginning, we'll send you a link to the recorded version of this. That'll be in your inbox in a few days' time, and all of the live attendees will get a certificate. That's our way of saying thank you. Also, any questions that we don't have time to get through today, we will keep on record. We'll send them on to our partners at JMP, and hopefully they'll be able to get back to you with an answer. So that's probably enough for this last poll. Let's just have a look and see how people thought. So a resounding 81% of our audience today see a possible application in their own field of expertise for the JMP simulation experiment tool. Now, Claire, that sort of leads me to my first question. Obviously, you talked about this as your project and your approach to this project. Do you use JMP in other sort of fields within your company? Do you use it in manufacturing? Do you use it in quality checking and so on, or was this something that was just you?
No, so JMP in general, we're using it in different departments. So the analytical department, for example, is using JMP to do statistics on their methods that they've been developing. Then in process development, we're using it for process optimization. And then later on in production, it's crucial. It's a crucial tool for process validation studies, including process characterization. So in general, yes, so we're using JMP in many different areas, and this specific application is it's something that we've been developing and working on as a new tool, so as something that we can bring in addition to what's already currently done, which is essentially maximizing titer only.
So how do you, within the company, how do you go about sort of rolling out and convincing everybody that this new tool is the right way to do things? Clearly, your own project acts as a nice case study. Can you just then take the results, take the output from JMP, show how easy it is to actually do this, and convince people in the rest of your building, the rest of your business, that this is the approach that they should adopt?
Yeah, so the big challenge here is that it's a risk mitigation tool. So it won't get you higher yields, but it will get you something which is a point which is more robust. And I mean, the effects of this you can only see then much later on when it's running in production, and then you're seeing if the process is running well or not. So it's something. Yeah, it's a new approach, and it's hard to to get there, but it's already a good step forward, I think, with this case study, showing it that we can get results quite quickly. So in worst case, it's just an analysis done on the side. Doesn't mean we have to draw conclusions or change the process, but at least we gain some process understanding.
You talk about it as a risk mitigation strategy. I mean, what are the risks of not taking this sort of approach? What could be the impact downstream if you haven't thought about these things up front?
Well, then you realize when it's running in production that you have a lot of variability. So you don't have your process under control. And yeah, it's mainly this aspect I can think of.
And I guess if that variability, if it's in something like yield, then it becomes hard to predict, you know, for example, how much you'll be able to sell, which hits the bottom line. If that variability is in quality, and in particular in a pharma industry, I mean, that can, if you have a batch that doesn't pass QA, then that's a really serious problem.
Yeah.
So it's always worth trying to adopt these risk mitigation strategies as early as possible. I guess the other thing, you talked about this as a project, which makes it sound like a standalone, self-contained, we do this and then it's done thing. Is this is this something you could apply or should apply on a regular basis, or is this a one and done? We do it at the start of the project and then we just take its results and move on.
So this project was a bit like proof of concept, and then what we want to do is then add this as an analysis during process development. So it might not be, yeah, it's adding an analysis that we are currently not doing into our process development.
So the idea would be that this would becomes part of your standard operating procedure, that this would be an approach that you take, rather than it being something that you do on an ad hoc basis and then sort of forget about it till next time. It becomes part of the process for everybody. Everybody then has that risk mitigation in place, and hopefully helps to maintain consistency when you then start to scale things up and put things into full process. Excellent. We had a question from Eric. Sorry, all my questions are on a different screen, which is why I'm looking away from you. So Eric asked, do you keep all the variables in your model, even if they are of sort of low probability?
No, so we applied a threshold, a p-value threshold of 0.05. There was an exception with one of the parameters, which was the feed rate. Because for us, from a scientific point of view, it didn't make sense to leave it out. So this was an exception, we left it in, but otherwise we apply this threshold of 0.05. So all factors which are not significant to that level are then removed. Hope this answers the question.
Hopefully, Eric, I'm sure Eric, if he has a follow-up question, will let us know. So thank you for your question there, Eric. Obviously, so you work in microbial fermentation processes. I've mentioned pharma in there. Is this approach widely applicable across the chemical and biological sciences, or is this the sort of thing that you would only see niche use for?
Oh, so it's applicable to any process, whether it's chemical process or biopharmaceutical process. What you need is factors and responses, and any project where you can build a DOE model describing the relationship between factors and responses, then I think it should be applicable, should be able to do it.
So the material science people who are currently watching shouldn't feel left out, as long as they have a process where there are these measurable outcomes and there are things that you need to constrain the variability within, which is often the case in material science, of course. Then this is still the right sort of approach. Clearly, our case study today is of your example, but it can be applied far more widely than that.
Yeah, I would say so.
We've still got a few minutes left, so let's bring Emmanuel in. Now, Emmanuel has been answering a few of your questions in the background, and he's one of our regular JMP experts who is a senior systems engineer for JMP. He supports customer development in France. He was an R&D project manager for Beckman Coulter, following a role as industrial development manager at Immunotech. So he's worked in a variety of different fields and knows how to apply JMP. So obviously one of the questions I asked earlier was about the technology involved in using JMP. What sorts of platforms do you find people move from to get to JMP? So if you are currently using Excel, for example, to managing all your data, is it therefore tempting to move to a more suitable platform like JMP?
Oh, I mean, yeah, definitely. That's what happened to me when I was at Beckman. We were introduced to statistical software through JMP. And the first step is maybe sometimes difficult, especially in France, I would say, because we tend to approach statistics on a too theoretical way. But once you've been trained on JMP, it's much more practical. And on our side, discovering DOE was really helpful to improve our capability and our efficiency, definitely.
Well, and clearly it caught your interest as you've jumped across to JMP itself, and you're definitely an evangelist for the things that JMP can do for us. So we've had questions we're asking. It was mentioned a few times, but perhaps some of the background theory behind it. Why was using a Gaussian process the right way to go for this project?
Yeah, so that's an important point. The fact is that, as you've seen, I mean, you've got a model where you tend to predict from inputs a certain number of outputs. Here, I think, Claire, there were only one output, which is concentration, but you may imagine that there is several outputs. And for each of them, you predict a value. And depending on the relationship you've got, as Claire mentioned, the mean value and the standard deviation. And then you transform that in a pass-fail output, since it depends on the spec limit. So depending on the mean value and the standard deviation, it will pass or it will fail. So it becomes a binomial distribution. And then you cannot anymore apply, I mean, you can apply some traditional statistical tools, but the fact is that you are encountering a cliff. It's not a smooth transition from fail to pass. It's either fail or pass. So there is a cliff. And especially if there is multiple outputs, there is a complex cliff. And to go through that, that's the benefit of using the simulation. You simulate across the whole design space, and you use the Gaussian process to better predict where or when you move from pass to fail or the reverse way. So that's the reason why we are using this kind of tool, which also account for the inherent variability on your X. As Claire mentioned, she was using a uniform distribution to to modelize the variability on your inputs. So you may think that you are setting something in manufacturing, for example, but there is always a certain tolerance. If it's a temperature, for example, it will change. And once it reach a limit, it goes the other direction. So there is always a certain fluctuation. So ultimately, that's the reason why we're using this evolved tool such as Gaussian process.
I see. How much of the background mathematics, the statistics, do you need to fully understand in order to use this as a way of modeling and predicting your experimentation? How much of that statistical knowledge does a user need if they are, instead an expert in microbial fermentation, for example? Do you then need to start learning statistics before you can start actually deploying this?
We can both answer, I think, Claire. I was, as you mentioned, I was a former JMP user, customer. So, I mean, I started with a very low level, very basic level in statistics. Later, I was interested on those topics, so I continue some education. But my colleagues around me at Beckman Coulter did not necessarily follow the same path. And you honestly don't need any statistical knowledge to start using JMP. After, I would say, as any science, to have a critical view on your results, it's good to acquire some knowledge, but you don't need a PhD in statistics. I mean, a reasonable graduate level is probably enough for 90–95% of the activity. What is good, I would say, it's what happened in my company, is that we had, I would say, a true statistician. So when we had any doubt, we've been to him to ask him, am I doing right or am I doing wrong? So Claire, on your side, I don't know, what's your feeling?
No, I had exactly the same feeling that you need some background in statistics, some basics in statistics, but the most important is to have a critical view on your results, always asking yourself, does this make any sense? And you don't, yeah, I would say you need statistics, but you also need the process expertise, and bridging the gap between these two fields is extremely important, and when you have bridged this, then it's really valuable.
Excellent. Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but thank you so much, Claire. Thank you, Emmanuel, for joining us, jumping in at the end and lending your jump expertise for us as well. Claire, that was a fantastic walkthrough, a very interesting case study, and it's really interesting to see, because we work with jump so often, of course, they bring us all of these different case studies, and we understand the background of what jump can do, and then it's lovely to have a guest like yourself brought in to really show how it works out in the real world. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you to Jump in the whole for working with us on this series of webinars. That is it for today's webinar. We will send you a link to the recorded version. Everybody who's attended live, you will also get a certificate as our way of saying thanks. Final thank you to Jump, to Claire, Emmanuel, and to my team, Chris and Francis in the background, who are keeping everything running very smoothly. Keep an eye on chemistryworld.com/webinars for other upcoming Jump events if you'd like to learn more about design of experiments and how you can use this sort of software in a statistical background to make your own experiments and scientific work that little bit more rewarding. And you may also see some other things coming up that you are interested in. While you're there at Chemistry World, why not register for an account? And that way you can read more news stories, more features, etc. while you're with us, and we can let you know about upcoming events as well. So it'd be great to have you on board in the Chemistry World family. I'm Ben Valsler, Chemistry World's digital editor, and I'd like to thank you once more for joining us today. We'll see you for the next Chemistry World webinar. Thank you very much.